This is Omar Nashashibi in Washington, D.C., with an update on how the federal government is responding to the Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore on March 26, 2024. On April 5th, President Biden took an aerial tour of the accident site that caused the tragic loss of life, where he gave remarks in Baltimore following that tour. Here we have a review of the impact of the Port of Baltimore and the Key Bridge on supply chains, the timeline for reopening the various transitways, and potential federal government support, including financial. The Port of Baltimore is one of the few in the nation which ranks in the top 20 busiest in three major categories: total tonnage rank, dry bulk rank, and overall container traffic. It is the closest Atlantic port of entry for the Midwest and thousands of manufacturers in supply chains supporting virtually every sector in the United States and global economies. The port is a major thoroughfare for commodities, components, and finished products heading in and out of the United States. As widely reported, Baltimore is the top entry point for $27 billion in motor vehicles and parts being imported into the United States and $8 billion of autos and parts exported overseas. The Port of Baltimore also ranks top in the United States for transporting of roll-on, roll-off, heavy farm and construction equipment and machinery, and also handled more than $2 billion in each of chemicals and aluminum and $1 billion each for iron and steel, nickel, wood, electronics, and furniture, among other goods coming in and out of the ports. Baltimore is critical for coal exports, as few other terminals in the U.S. have the storage and loading capabilities. As the second largest exporting hub in the country, coal exports from the port accounted for 28% of the total shipped from the United States, reaching a high 28 million short tons in 2023. The disruption will impact a number of countries, including India, which is the largest recipient for U.S. steam coal, followed by Japan, China, and Brazil, which each receive millions in short tons of metallurgical coal from the port and coming through the Port of Baltimore. Some port traffic could temporarily shift to New York, New Jersey, and down to Roanoke, Norfolk, Virginia, but especially in the case of coal, specific storage requirements exist that are included for onloading and offloading vehicles and large machinery. Those capabilities just are not at every port on the eastern seaboard, and that will lead to further disruptions. On April 4th, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers provided an aggressive timeline for reopening the Fort McHenry Channel, allowing the Port of Baltimore to return to full operating status. The Corps said that it expects to open by the end of April a 280 feet wide by 35 feet wide channel that would be on a limited basis deep enough to start in and out of some of the traffic that could possibly resume. The goal is to allow one-way traffic for barge containers and some of the roll-on, roll-off autos and farm equipment machinery that has been sitting and idling at the port or destined to start rolling in and out if they are able to get this temporary basis open by the end of April. The Army Corps of Engineers in that April 4th statement also said that they are targeting by the end of May this year to fully restore normal capacity at the Port of Baltimore. Many consider this an aggressive timeline, but the return to normalcy roughly 60 days after the incident would be welcome news for much of the U.S. and global supply chain if, in fact, they are able to meet that end of May timeline for full reopening. On April 7th, response crews began removing some of the containers that still remain on the ship that need to be removed in order for the remediation process and also for removing parts of the bridge that still remain in place. So with regard to those container boxes that began again on April 7th, that will take several more days as they continue to work with those coordinated efforts. They have created a specific website that is keybridgeresponse2024.com, and those are the various government entities. There are roughly half a dozen or so that are coordinating their activities ranging from the Department of Transportation here in Washington, D.C., to the various entities in Annapolis and in Baltimore and throughout the state of Maryland. While much of the focus, though, has been on that Port of Baltimore, officials expect that vessel activity will return to normal much more quickly than traffic reliant on the Key Bridge. In 2023, roughly 12.5 million vehicles crossed over that bridge, averaging 34,000 vehicles a day. Government transportation officials stated that, quote, diverted traffic would add 18% to the combined volumes for Fort McHenry and the additional tunnel, the harbor tunnel that's there. And those two tunnels are going to be now the major entry and access point through going around the city and through the city of Baltimore. When we had 3 different areas and corridors for which they could go through, now you're down to 2 without that bridge being there. The Maryland Department of Transportation has created that additional website to help direct traffic patterns to avoid the southeast corridor of I-95, directing harbor crossings, alternate routes as I-95 or I-895. Now, the challenge with that, however, comes in with that additional volume of cargo and control there that's going to come through. The Baltimore Key Bridge was essential to the mid-Atlantic hazardous cargo, much of which is barred from passage through those two harbor tunnels, and that is going to be a major issue for that hazardous cargo that's going to be moved and shipped via truck. It normally would go over that Key Bridge, but it is illegal and impermissible to go through those two tunnels that are the current access point, which could potentially lead some trucks rerouting completely around the city of Baltimore, even beyond the Beltway, and that could add significant time as they travel through the mid-Atlantic. Thus far, the state of Maryland has requested and received roughly $60 million through the Federal Highway Administration's Emergency Relief Program, and that's a start from where we expect the federal government to go. The Infrastructure and Jobs Act, known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was signed by President Biden in 2022, authorizes $100 million annually for the emergency relief from 2021 through 2026. That law built on a previous program and allows the Secretary of Transportation to use funds for emergency repairs due to external causes resulting in catastrophic failure. And while the bridge itself appears to clearly fall within the intention of that law, funding for the Port of Baltimore itself and other cleanup, remediation, and construction activities will likely need other federal dollars and other sources that come with it. There are also limits as to how far the emergency relief fund can go, as Congress clearly intended the $100 million in annual spending to address projects and incidents throughout the United States. Currently, the account contains roughly $950 million as the Biden administration looks at the quickest options to deploy resources in the assistance programs. As to timing of any relief from Capitol Hill in the U.S. Congress, which is where the bulk of the funding must originate, Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer from New York has started the process and is speaking with colleagues on a supplemental package. In October 2023, the Biden administration sent lawmakers a $634 million domestic supplemental funding request to repair federal highways and roads damaged during disasters. While Capitol Hill did not act at the time, there is talk in Washington about possibly including the Baltimore Bridge funding in a broader supplemental spending measure this spring or early this summer that could contain some of the priorities that were identified by the White House back in the fall of 2023. There remain many moving parts, including objections from some over how the federal government would go about paying for this unexpected spending, as some House Republicans have already indicated they would like conditions attached to any funding measure. We are also hearing from sources here in Washington, D.C., that rebuilding the bridge with federal dollars would also include the Buy America and Buy American funding for any procurement or government financial assistance. This means U.S. manufactured products, including iron and steel, being produced domestically as part of the components that would go into the rebuilding of both the port and the bridge there. Moving this through the U.S. Congress will take some time, as will most consider this a must-pass bill. It will still take bipartisan votes in both the House and Senate to clear a number of hurdles expected in the coming weeks and months. CLA will be watching the developments for both the port and the bridge closely, as officials in Washington, D.C., how much more and where they're able to spend some dollars most effectively and efficiently in the coming weeks and months, especially as the Army Corps of Engineers moves forward on an ambitious timeline to try to reopen the port to normal operations by the end of May. As always, please reach out to CLA for more information on this and other trade and supply chain related matters.